For this video, I'm going to be doing some review of some number sense concepts that we were touching base on in class. I'm going to review place value, rounding, adding of decimals, and the different forms that numbers can be written in. So first we're going to talk about place value. So our numbers are organized into groups, and we have whole numbers that are to the left of our decimal point, and then we have our decimals, or those numbers that are parts of a whole that are to the right of our decimal. The names for those places are similar, they just have different endings. I'm going to start with our whole numbers to the left of the decimal. They're grouped into threes, and this helps us because it tells us the name of that grouping. So when we're reading that number, we know what group name to say at the end of the three. So when we're reading a number, we always read it in groups of three with its sort of group name at the end. And I'll review that when I read the number. The first group here is called units because we can sometimes have each of these place values read on their own, right? We can have like the value of 6, or we can have 16, or we can have 116. 116, sorry, no ands. And so it doesn't have a group for this group of three because there are times when we'd be reading these individually where it would never happen for these other groupings. Okay, the first is the ones, then we have the tens, and the hundreds. Those are our units. Thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s. Those are our thousands. We have million, 10 million, 100 million. Those are our millions. And then it would go billion, 10 billion, 100 billion, then trillion, 10 billion. So there's a pattern. So when we're reading these numbers, we read it as its group. So I would read 461 million, 461,000, 461. Then we have our decimal. Right to the right of our decimal is tenths, then hundreds, and then thousands is another group of three. There would be thousands, 10,000ths, 100,000ths, and then it would go another group of millions. But for our purposes, we're just going to go for the three place values. And we would read each one of these as an individual. So we would read 461 million, 461,000, 461, and 461. Do we notice that the only time I said and was when I was saying the decimal, because and represents a decimal. And it's tricky. We know that, and sometimes it just comes into our vocabulary when we're saying the word. But we really want to try and remember that when we're reading whole numbers, it's not 461 or 461,000 and 461. The and represents the decimal point. Okay. So when we're rounding, there are a couple stages to rounding. The first one is to locate the number or the place value that we are rounding to. So if I say we're going to round to the nearest 10. So first I'm going to find the tens column in my number. So I know there's my decimal. I know these are my whole numbers. These are my decimals. So I know the first column is the ones column. The next column is the tens column. So I've located my number. The next is I'm going to look to the right of that number. So I look to the right of that number, and it's a 1. So then I need to decide what to do. And then your decision is, you can either stay at 7, or 70, the value 70, or I can go up to 80. Now, if we think about it logically, 71 is much closer to 70 than it is to 80. And you can look at that on your number line. 71 would be right here. I'm 1 step away from 70, and I'm 9 steps away from 80. Where if it was 76, 6 is closer to 80 than it would be to 70. So if it's 5, the rule is 5 and above, you go up to the next place value, so the next 10, so in this case it would be the next 10, which would be 80, and if it's 4 and below, you stay at your current value. And then we rewrite the entire number. Here's where some of us make a mistake. Everything to the left of our place value that we're looking for, so everything to the left of the 7 stays exactly the same. Everything to the right becomes a 0. So I would rewrite this number 670. And I don't need to write decimal 00 because these digits now have a value of 0. I don't need to hold their places. All right, so let's say I was going to round to the nearest 100. I would look to the 6 to find my place value. Then I would look to the right. It's a 7. But if I look at this, I know that 670 is closer to 700 than it is to 600. And I can check here. The 7 is closer to the 10 than it is to the 0. So the rule is 5 and above, you round up. So 671.63 rounded to the nearest 100 would be 700. And it would be the same for my decimal. The rule doesn't change just because it's a decimal. You find that the place value and then you look to the right to determine whether or not you stay or you go high. Adding decimals. The major rule is you need to line up the decimal. If there is a whole number and it doesn't have a decimal, you need to remember that the decimal point is just to the right of the last whole number. This is the ones, tens, hundreds column, so we know the decimal point goes here. So when we're adding these numbers together, we just need to line up the decimal points. So there's my 1,647, and there's my decimal 68, 2, decimal 4, and I've added these sort of placeholders, the zeros with the lines through them, just makes it a little bit easier visually. You don't have to do that, but you just need to make sure that you line up the decimals when you're adding up the numbers. And the last is the different forms that we can write a number in. So we have standard form, which is what we would see sort of in a math textbook. It's the number written numerically as a number. Expanded form talks about the value of the number. So we would have 1,000 plus 400 plus 60 plus 1. We have it in written form using words, 1,461. And then as an extension, we have powers. So we would write the value of the digit times 10 to the power of its placeholder. And you can remember that by thinking about how many zeros would be after that digit. So, for example, 1 in this number is 1 times 10 to the power of 3. So 1 times 10 to the power of 3, so the value of 1 is 1,000, right? 4 times 10 to the power of 2. So 4 times 10 to the power of 2, 400. 6 times 10 to the power of 1 is 60. And 1 times 10 to the power of 0 is 1. So that's just a quick review of some of the concepts we were talking about in number sense.